Raghav, Samir, and Anika's lives seemed ordinary when they moved into the cramped New Jersey apartment. But beneath the surface of bills, secrets, and borrowed money, tension was quietly building, until one night it erupted into a deadly tragedy no one saw coming. Please subscribe for daily new update of crime story and watch till end. Raghav Malhotra arrived in the United States with a single suitcase and years of hope resting on his shoulders. He was born and raised in a middle-class family in Indore, India, where his parents had spent their savings to support his education abroad. Getting admission to a public university in New Jersey felt like a victory not just for him, but for his entire family. The moment he landed in the U.S., reality began to feel heavier than his dreams. Everything was expensive, unfamiliar, and fast-paced. Raghav knew that to survive, he would have to live carefully and spend as little as possible. Finding housing was the first challenge. University dorms were far beyond his budget, and private apartments required high deposits. After days of searching online and through community groups, he found a shared apartment listed by another Indian immigrant. The rent was low, the location was close to public transport, and utilities were shared. It felt like the only option he could afford. That is how he met Samir Kulkarni, a man in his early 30s, who had been living in the U.S. for several years. The apartment itself was old and slightly worn down. The walls had marks from years of tenants coming and going, and the heating system made strange noises at night. Still, to Raghav, it was a place to start his new life. He took the smaller bedroom, barely fitting a bed, desk, and suitcase. Samir lived in the larger room and had control over most household matters, including rent payments and utility accounts. Samir appeared quiet and reserved. He worked long night shifts and slept during the day. Their schedules rarely matched, which made the shared living arrangement feel distant but manageable. Raghav assumed this lack of interaction would reduce conflict. At first, things seemed fine. Bills were paid, the kitchen was shared without issue, and both kept to themselves. However, beneath this calm surface, discomfort slowly began to grow. Raghav noticed that Samir was strict about payments and often reminded him about deadlines through notes and messages. Small things, like electricity usage and heating time, were closely monitored. Raghav felt pressure but blamed it on the stress of living in a new country. What Raghav did not realize was that Samir himself was under financial strain. The apartment was more than just a shared space. It was a fragile balance between two men struggling to survive in a foreign land. The walls of the apartment held unspoken worries, silent calculations, and growing resentment. What began as a practical arrangement was quietly turning into a situation filled with tension, setting the stage for events that no one could have imagined at the time. As winter settled in, the cost of living inside the apartment began to rise in ways neither man had expected. The heating system ran almost constantly, and the electricity meter seemed to move faster each day. Raghav noticed the change first when Samir forwarded copies of utility bills with highlighted amounts. The numbers were much higher than before, and the payment deadlines were tight. Raghav carefully reviewed the bills, trying to understand how a small apartment could generate such expenses. He felt uneasy but paid his share on time, not wanting to create problems. Over the following weeks, the situation became more uncomfortable. Samir began tracking every shared expense in detail. He wrote down electricity usage, internet costs, and even minor repairs. Raghav felt as though he was being watched. He limited his heater use, turned off lights quickly, and avoided staying in common areas. Despite these efforts, the bills continued to increase. Samir insisted the costs were fair and blamed seasonal changes. Raghav quietly began to suspect that something was wrong. The tension never exploded openly, but it lingered in the air. The apartment no longer felt like a safe place to rest. Raghav found himself double-checking his bank balance every night. His part-time campus job barely covered food and transport, and any extra expense created anxiety. He began skipping meals and spending more time at the library just to avoid being at home. The rent, once manageable, started to feel like a heavy weight pressing down on him. At the same time, Samir's behavior grew more rigid. Payment reminders came earlier and more frequently. Notes were left in shared spaces listing amounts owed and dates. Raghav felt embarrassed and powerless. As an international student, he feared any conflict that could affect his housing or visa status. He told himself to endure it until the semester ended. What Raghav did not know was that Samir was struggling deeply. His warehouse job had cut hours, and debt from previous months was piling up. Late fees from utility companies were adding pressure. Instead of explaining his situation, Samir tried to recover losses by being strict with shared expenses. Each unpaid dollar felt like a threat to his stability. The financial issue slowly turned into a silent battle. Both men felt wronged, and neither trusted the other completely. Money, which had once been a simple arrangement, became a dividing line inside the apartment. Every bill carried suspicion. Every reminder added bitterness. Without arguments or raised voices, resentment quietly grew. The dispute over rent and expenses was no longer just about numbers. It was shaping their thoughts, their routines, and their sense of security. Unknown to both of them, this unresolved tension was pushing them closer to a situation that would soon spiral beyond control. As the months passed, the shared apartment began to feel less like a temporary stop and more like a place filled with unanswered questions. Raghav started noticing patterns in Samir's life that did not make sense to him. Letters from different companies arrived almost every week, some marked urgent. Samir usually collected the mail quickly, but a few envelopes were left behind by mistake. Raghav avoided reading them, yet the bold warning labels and unfamiliar agency names made him uneasy. It was clear that Samir was dealing with more than just high utility bills. Late one evening, while returning from the library, Raghav found the apartment unusually quiet. Samir was awake, sitting in the living room, staring at his phone with a tense expression. The television was off, and the lights were dim. Raghav sensed something was wrong. Without saying a word, he went to his room, but the image stayed in his mind. From that night on, he began to pay closer attention to his surroundings. Small details started to connect. Samir's job schedule kept changing. Some weeks he worked long shifts, while other weeks he stayed home for days. Raghav overheard phone calls filled with frustration and urgency. The tone was sharp, and the calls often ended abruptly. Although no words were clearly understood, the stress was obvious. Raghav began to doubt if Samir was hiding serious financial trouble. At the same time, Samir grew curious about Raghav's life. He asked indirect questions about his studies, work hours, and immigration paperwork. Raghav answered carefully, aware of how vulnerable his situation was. His student visa depended on maintaining enrollment and stable housing. Any disruption could put everything at risk. He realized that Samir now knew this and might use it to his advantage if conflict arose. Trust between them continued to break down. Raghav started keeping his documents locked away and avoided leaving personal items in shared spaces. He felt exposed and powerless in a country where he had little support. Meanwhile, Samir appeared increasingly restless. He slept less, paced the apartment often, and reacted sharply to minor inconveniences. The man who once seemed quiet and distant now felt unpredictable. The apartment became a place of silent observation. Each person watched the other closely, trying to understand intentions and weaknesses. What neither realized was that this growing awareness was dangerous. Information, once harmless, had turned into leverage. Fear replaced cooperation. Instead of discussing issues openly, both men retreated into their own thoughts. Raghav considered moving out but found no affordable options. Samir, facing mounting pressure, felt trapped as well. Their shared space had become a tense environment where secrets carried weight. The hidden past of one and the fragile future of the other were now intertwined. The apartment no longer held just two tenants, but two lives balanced on uncertainty, slowly drifting toward a breaking point neither of them could stop. The night began like any other, quiet and uneventful, wrapped in the heavy stillness of winter. Outside, the streets were nearly empty, and snow piled against the sidewalks. Inside the apartment, The heating system hummed unevenly, filling the rooms with a dull mechanical sound. Samir returned home earlier than usual, something that rarely happened. His jacket was still on as he moved through the apartment, his steps slower than normal. The air felt tense, as if something unseen had entered with him. Raghav was in his room, focused on coursework, unaware that this night would change everything. The walls of the apartment were thin, and faint movements could be heard, but nothing that suggested danger. Time passed quietly. The clock moved toward midnight, and the building settled into silence. Neighbors later recalled hearing a sudden thud, followed by the sound of something hitting the floor. It was brief and unclear, not enough to raise immediate alarm in an old building where noise was common. What happened inside the apartment during those moments remained unclear at first. By early morning, the stillness became unsettling. Samir's room door was closed, and the lights inside were off. The front door of the apartment was slightly open, letting cold air drift in. When a neighbor noticed this and looked inside, something felt wrong. Emergency services were called soon after. Police arrived to find Samir lying motionless on the floor of his room. He had suffered a severe head injury. There were no signs of a struggle in the common areas, and nothing appeared stolen. The apartment looked almost normal, except for the unnatural silence surrounding the body. Raghav was nowhere to be found. His phone was off, and his belongings were still in his room. The scene immediately raised suspicion. Investigators noted that there was no forced entry, suggesting the victim knew the person who entered the apartment. The unlocked door added another layer of mystery. Why would someone leave in such a hurry? Why was Raghav missing? The earlier rent disputes quickly became part of the investigation, giving authorities a possible motive. As news spread through the building, fear and confusion followed. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, replaying the sounds they had heard during the night. Some mentioned footsteps in the hallway, others recalled a shadow near the stairs. Nothing was clear enough to form a solid picture. By sunrise, the apartment was sealed off with police tape. What had once been a shared living space for two struggling immigrants was now a crime scene. The quiet tension that had built over months had ended in sudden violence. At that moment, all signs pointed toward a simple explanation, but the truth was far more complex. The night had ended one life and pushed another into uncertainty, leaving behind questions that would soon unravel a shocking reality. The investigation moved quickly in the days that followed, but nothing about the case felt simple. Inside the apartment, forensics teams worked carefully, documenting every detail. Furniture was examined, surfaces were dusted, and the layout of the rooms was mapped out. At first glance, the scene suggested a sudden act rather than a prolonged confrontation. There were no signs of broken furniture or widespread damage. The absence of chaos only deepened the mystery of how the fatal injury occurred. Samir's head injury appeared severe, but oddly specific. Medical examiners noted that the force used did not match what would normally happen in a physical fight between roommates. There were no defensive wounds on his arms, and no signs of repeated blows. This raised questions about the sequence of events. Investigators considered the possibility of an accident, but the angle and intensity of the injury ruled that out. Something deliberate had happened. Attention remained focused on Raghav's disappearance. His room was untouched, with clothes neatly arranged and study materials still on the desk. His passport and important documents were missing, which made police believe he had left intentionally. This strengthened suspicion against him, especially in the early stages. However, his laptop and some cash were still inside the apartment, an unusual detail for someone planning to escape permanently. As detectives dug deeper, inconsistencies began to appear. The timing of the injury did not align perfectly with Raghav's known movements earlier that night. Security footage from nearby streets showed him leaving the building hours before the estimated time of death. This discovery complicated the narrative. If Raghav was not present at the time, who was? Further examination revealed faint shoe prints near the apartment entrance that did not match either roommate. They were partially erased, as if someone had tried to avoid leaving evidence. Investigators also noticed that Samir's phone was missing. Calls made earlier that evening could not be traced directly, leaving gaps in the timeline. The building's security system became a key focus. Although cameras inside the hallway had limited coverage, one camera near the back entrance captured a figure entering late at night. The person's face was unclear, but their build and movement suggested someone familiar with the space. This shifted the investigation in a new direction. What once seemed like a straightforward case of a rent dispute turning violent was now unraveling. Each new detail challenged earlier assumptions. The absence of clear evidence, combined with the presence of unknown factors, forced investigators to reconsider their approach. Public opinion, however, had already formed. Rumors spread quickly, painting Raghav as the likely suspect. Online discussions and community whispers ignored the growing doubts in the case. Behind the scenes, detectives worked against time, aware that the truth was hidden beneath layers of misleading appearances. The evidence did not lie, but it refused to tell a simple story. The breakthrough came when investigators decided to focus less on assumptions and more on the unexplored connections in Samir's life. Financial records were reviewed in detail, revealing transactions that had nothing to do with household expenses. Several large transfers stood out, moving between accounts over a short period of time. These payments did not match Samir's income and suggested borrowed money. When questioned, his employer confirmed that Samir had been under financial pressure long before the rent issues began. Digging deeper, detectives uncovered the name Amit Verma, a former co-worker from the warehouse where Samir once worked. Amit had left the job abruptly months earlier, following a disagreement over money. Records showed that Amit had lent Samir a significant amount of cash during a difficult period. The agreement was informal, built on trust rather than legal paperwork. Over time, repayments stopped, and the debt grew. Messages recovered from Samir's cloud account showed increasing tension, with repeated demands for repayment. This discovery shifted the entire direction of the case. Amit Verma was no longer just a name in the background. Investigators tracked his recent movements and found that he had been living nearby, changing addresses frequently. This behavior raised concern. When questioned, Amit initially denied any involvement, claiming he had not spoken to Samir in weeks. However, phone records and location data told a different story. One critical detail changed everything. A spare key to the apartment had been given to Amit months earlier, back when he and Samir were still on good terms. Samir had forgotten to retrieve it. This explained the lack of forced entry and why the apartment door had been left unlocked. Investigators now understood how someone could enter without drawing attention. As pressure increased, Amit's story began to fall apart. His timeline contained gaps, and his explanations grew inconsistent. Surveillance footage placed him near the apartment on the night of the killing. The build and movement matched the unidentified figure captured earlier. Combined with the financial motive, the evidence became overwhelming. For detectives, the truth was both shocking and frustrating. The case had initially been clouded by surface-level conflict between roommates, hiding the real danger that came from outside the household. The rent dispute had been a distraction, not the cause. When Amit was formally charged, the revelation stunned the community. The idea that a trusted acquaintance could turn violent over unpaid debt served as a harsh reminder of how desperation can twist loyalty into rage. What seemed like a private financial matter had ended in irreversible loss. The investigation had finally uncovered the real reason behind the killing, exposing how one hidden connection changed everything. Raghav was found nearly a week later in a small town, several states away, living quietly in a budget motel near a bus station. He had not contacted anyone since leaving the apartment, and his phone remained switched off. When authorities located him, he did not resist. His exhaustion was visible, and he appeared more frightened than defiant. Investigators quickly realized that he was not running from guilt, but from fear. After the discovery of Samir's body, Raghav had panicked. He had returned to the apartment late at night and sensed that something was terribly wrong. The door was open, The lights were off, and the air inside felt heavy. He had seen Samir lying on the floor and immediately understood that a crime had taken place. With his mind racing, he made a decision that would later haunt him. Instead of calling for help, he let Raghav's immigration status played a major role in his actions. As an international student, he believed that being linked to a violent crime could destroy his future, even if he was innocent. Fear overpowered reason. He packed his passport and a few essentials, leaving behind most of his belongings. He boarded the first bus he could afford, without a clear destination, hoping only to disappear long enough to think. During the days that followed, Raghav lived in constant anxiety. News reports began circulating, and he realized that his absence was being interpreted as guilt. Every headline increased his panic. He avoided public places and kept interactions to a minimum. Sleep came in short bursts, interrupted by thoughts of police knocking on his door. The weight of his choice grew heavier with each passing hour. When questioned, Raghav explained his actions in detail. Investigators checked his travel records, bus tickets, and security footage, all of which confirmed his movements. The timeline proved he had left the building before the estimated time of death and had not returned until later. Forensic evidence supported his account. There was no trace of his involvement in the killing. Slowly, suspicion against Raghav began to fade. Authorities acknowledged that fear had driven him to make a poor decision, but not a criminal one. His case highlighted how vulnerability and misunderstanding of the legal system can lead innocent people to act irrationally. Although cleared of the crime, Raghav's life was permanently changed. The apartment he once considered a starting point had become a symbol of trauma. Trust, safety, and ambition had been replaced by caution and loss. Even in freedom, the shadow of that night followed him, reminding him how quickly fear can turn a witness into a suspect. The aftermath of the case left a deep mark on everyone involved. Amit Verma was arrested and later convicted of murder, but the impact extended far beyond the courtroom. The immigrant community in New Jersey, particularly those who shared apartments, was shaken. The idea that a simple debt could escalate to violence caused widespread fear and anxiety. Conversations among friends and neighbors shifted from casual gossip to warnings about trust and personal safety. Many realized that even familiar faces could conceal dangerous intentions. Raghav struggled to rebuild his life. Though legally cleared of any wrongdoing, the emotional toll of being suspected of a crime he did not commit was immense. Every interaction carried a shadow of doubt, and he often found himself replaying the events of that night in his mind. Sleep was difficult, and even mundane tasks like grocery shopping or using public transport caused unease. He knew that the apartment, the place he once called home, would never feel safe again. The physical space had transformed into a symbol of loss, fear, and betrayal. Samir's family in India received the devastating news far from home. They had celebrated his journey abroad as a sign of independence and success, only to learn that his life had ended abruptly in circumstances they could barely understand. Funerals were held in absentia for some relatives, while others traveled to the United States to arrange formalities. The grief was compounded by confusion and unanswered questions. How had someone he trusted so easily turned on him? Why had the warnings and tensions inside the apartment gone unnoticed until it was too late? The apartment itself remained vacant for months. Neighbors reported an eerie silence, with occasional glimpses of movers and maintenance staff entering. The building management struggled to find tenants willing to live there, as the story of the killing had become widely known. The walls that once contained ordinary life now seemed to echo with tragedy, a constant reminder of how quickly everyday disputes can escalate. The authorities took steps to educate residents about shared housing risks. Community meetings were organized, focusing on financial transparency, conflict resolution, and safety precautions. People learned the importance of securing personal items, limiting informal loans, and recognizing warning signs before conflicts spiraled out of control. The tragedy became a case study in both local policing and immigrant safety initiatives. For Raghav, life slowly began to stabilize. He changed apartments, found a more supportive community, and focused on completing his studies. Yet the memory of that night remained, a lesson in caution and awareness. He became quietly vigilant, careful about whom he trusted and how he navigated conflicts. Ultimately, the story was not just about a rent dispute gone wrong. It was a cautionary tale about human vulnerability, the hidden consequences of debt and mistrust, and how a single moment of violence can ripple outward, affecting lives far beyond the immediate tragedy. The apartment, now empty, stood as a silent testament to the fragility of trust and the irreversible nature of choices made in fear, anger, or desperation. The events would be remembered not just for the crime itself, but for the profound impact it had on everyone connected to it.